This week, the New York Times came out with an article highlighting some of the data that shows that young men are falling behind, which is pretty shocking to see coming from the New York Times of all places. Things must be getting pretty bad for young men out there that they're now talking about it. I thought, according to the New York Times, that we lived in a patriarchy and we're full of all these toxic masculine misogynists everywhere. So let's dive right into it, shall we? It's not just a feeling. Data shows that boys and young men are falling behind. Boys' educational achievements, mental health, and transitions to adulthood indicate that many are not thriving. So I think anybody that knows young men out there probably has seen this for themselves. Let's go ahead and get back into the article. Boys and young men are struggling across their lives in their educational achievement, mental health, and transitions to adulthood. There are warning signs that they are falling behind even as their female peers are surging ahead. In the United States, researchers say several economic and social changes have combined to change boys' and men's trajectories. Schools have changed in ways to favor girls, and work has changed in ways to favor women. Boys are often seen as troublemakers, and men have heard that masculinity is toxic, mainly from people that write columns in the New York Times. Young people themselves tend to agree that girls are now at least equal to, if not doing better than boys. Many young men feel unmoored and undervalued, and parents and adults that work with children are worried about boys. It's not just a feeling, there's a wealth of data that boys and young men are stagnating. Below, I'll explain some of the data. Some boys have been affected more than others. The outcomes of black boys is worse, and growing up in poverty disproportionately hurts boys. And in some cases, these patterns aren't new. Boys are always lagged behind girls in certain areas, yet there is a little focus on their issues, perhaps because men have dominated in so many spheres. So it is the New York Times. They couldn't help themselves but throw a little bit of wokeness in there. In the article, they bring up young black boys being disproportionately affected by this. And I think it's kind of ironic that they don't bring up the issue of single parenthood and the fact that, there's 79% of African American children are born into a single parent household. So that's going to have a drastic effect, on someone's ability, especially young men. It affects everybody. It's really one of the worst things and one of the biggest, indicators of how successful someone's going to be in their life is if they grow up with the luxury of having, two parents in the house. And, basically every data point that you can think of and look at is going to be go down and be negative, if you're raised with a single mom. If you're a boy growing up with a single mom, then you're not going to have that motivating, stern figure in your life to really show you how to go out there into the world and, take on the challenges of life. And, you'll have your mom, which will be a great support system for you and a lot of compassion, all that thing that femininity and moms bring to the table. But, there's no substitute for, having two parents in your house and having a dad in your life. And the same thing goes for girls as well. They're going to suffer in different ways. They might have trouble because no one, will teach them what a good man is. They've never had a good man in their life, so they don't realize how to pick a man. And then, they might end up, getting pregnant by some guy who's not going to, support her or, be a responsible dad. And so, it can be like a endless cycle or repeating cycle from generation to generation. They also mention that boys growing up in low income families are disproportionately affected compared to girls. Well, that makes sense if you think about back to your own life and people that you've known. If there's a rich kid that grows up and, you're more likely to be, wealthy and have a good income yourself if you grow up, in that kind of family. But then even if you don't grow up to make a lot of money as a guy, at least your parents are loaded and, you'll have a either easier time dating than some guy that grew up broke, and never gets a career off the ground either. At least, as a guy that grew up in a rich family, you might be able to find a girl because she'll be like, oh, his family's loaded, so I'll get to, benefit some of that. Whereas, a girl, no one really cares what background she comes from for the most part. There are so many guys out there that, if you're a cute girl working at a grocery store bagging groceries, that guy is not going to care as long as you're, fit, friendly, and, good looking. Then, he'll sweep you out of your bad situation and hopefully elevate you to a better social economic status. So they go on in this article to discuss the academic struggles and the mental health struggles that men are having and going over some of that data. But what I really want to focus on in this short video is the transition to adulthood and how men are falling behind there and failing in a lot of cases. If you're enjoying this video, please go ahead and give it a like and subscribe to my channel too, so you can see what else I come up with in the future. I would really appreciate the support, and it helps out a lot. But back to the article. Though young people in general are taking longer to reach the traditional milestones of adulthood, it's particularly true for young men. Among men aged 25 to 34, 19% still live with their parents. That's up from 14% in 1983, according to census data. Of women of that age, 13% live with their parents, up from 11% 4 decades ago. While women and men used to be equally likely to be single, less than a third of those aged 25 to 54 were in 1990. Now, 39% of the men and 36% of women have no partner. A Pew Analysis census data found the mismatch may be because women often date older men. The work trajectories of men and women have diverged, as many of the jobs that mostly men did, like manual labor, have disappeared in the United States, while women dominate today's service-oriented work. The share of men working and looking for work has steadily declined, while the share of women working has rapidly climbed. So this is wild to me that this many men, 20% of them nearly, between the ages of 25 and 35, still live with their parents. I'm sure a big factor is the cost of living has gone up so much, and to buy a house, it's gone up astronomically over the past 5 years. But I feel like there's really just no excuses. Life is hard, and it's been hard for people since the dawn of man, okay? And, I feel like a lot of it's laziness or just not being, guided properly as a young man. You can't just work 40 hours a week or even less than that, and expect to be exceptional, unless you're like one of the lucky ones who got, you became a lawyer or a doctor or something like that, where you just make a ton of money working 40 hours a week. For most of us, that is not the case, okay? And you're going to have to get out there and bust your butt and work, 50, 60 hours a week and save up enough money so that, or, if you're working 40 hours a week, be getting an education or something to improve yourself so that you can be making, some serious money, in the near future, where you can go out and become self-reliant and support a family and all that. It's okay for girls to, live at home and, they can have their hot girl summer and go on this nice fancy vacation and work 40 hours a week. And, she's not going to have any problem finding a guy. There's a line of guys lined up down the block wanting to date her. But as a guy, if you want to have a family and children and have a high value woman, you got to get out there and bust it and compete against all these other men that are willing to do what you're not willing to do. I feel like young men just aren't given guidance on this, and there's not enough emphasis placed on work and achievement. And we're raised like we're the same as girls, which we really aren't the same in hardly any ways at all, and how we think and whatnot. But, they don't tell you how much, working hard and achievement is going to bring you fulfillment in your life. You're told that the same things that girls are told, that, oh, it's okay to be sad and upset and be depressed and, take a mental health day or make time for yourself and treat yourself, and all this nonsense, all this 21st century nonsense that we're taught in the West. And it wasn't until I was about 30 that I, started listening to Jordan Peterson and heard him talking about how hard work is going to, and achievement's going to make you respect yourself, and, accomplishing things is going to make you feel good about yourself. And then, after a month of just working flat out, you're like, wow, this actually feels pretty good. I'm not depressed anymore. I need to keep doing this thing, and you're making, as much money as you thought you were going to make when you were at like retirement age, and you're actually just, in your 30s still. And so you start feeling good about yourself. And it's a bad example, but back in the gulags in the Soviet Union, Solzhenitsyn, he talked about the saying that the guards had there, which they have signs everywhere that said, "The work will set you free," which is a bad example because, they were just trying to just screw with people's minds back then in the gulags. But if one good saying came out of the gulags, it's that work will set you free. At least as a man in the modern age, just relaxing and playing video games and stuff and looking at pornography is not going to bring you fulfillment in your life. And getting out there and making something of yourself actually might do that if you really apply yourself 100%. I'm kind of conflicted about this entire subject because obviously I care about it enough that I'm talking about it and made a video about it. But on the other hand, I really don't care if a guy wants to, sit in his mom's basement and play video games and watch pornography and take himself out of the genetic pool because I guess he doesn't think he's, got good enough genes to reproduce. But, well, if he's living that kind of life, he might actually be right about that. But also, I realize that men are super important in society and we need men out there, doing these jobs that are going to keep society functioning. And also, almost every problem that we face in society, I feel like, is a consequence of men not stepping up and being men and not leading where they need to. We're seeing all the woke nonsense going on that, it's really, you could say, toxic femininity leading that charge, and then on the other hand, also we see, like I mentioned earlier in the video, this sick cycle that repeats itself where, men and women grow up not, having a father figure in their life because they didn't have a man to be responsible and take charge and, provide for them and try and give them, the support and the father figure that they needed in their life when they were growing up. So it just repeats itself from one generation to the next. And really, like, no one out there is going to fix you. No one really cares about making your life good. No one really cares. Maybe your mom does, but the only one that can control this and make something of your life is you. So yeah, that's it. It's all on you. But that's all I got for you. If you enjoyed the video, give it a like I said, and thank you so much for watching.